In our employees pivot chart file, we have two pivot charts and both of them sit in their own sheets. So we have PChart and PChart2. Now, if you want to move a pivot chart so that it doesn't sit in its own sheet, but sits as an object in perhaps ptable, so it's next to the actual data table as well, so you can see any changes in both of them instantly, then we need to move the pivot chart. Moving the pivot chart is achieved by selecting the pivot chart. Selecting the pivot chart is not really a requirement when the pivot chart is a whole sheet. You simply need to be in the sheet. And then on the Pivot Chart Tools ribbon, we have Move Chart. And the option is either to move into a new sheet, and we can give that new sheet a name, but there's very little point in moving it into a new sheet when it's already in a full sheet, or as an object in, and we can choose an existing sheet. So we're going to move it into ptable. Okay. Notice that the full sheet is then removed because there's nothing on it, and we now have an object pivot chart that can be moved and resized to suit, but it's still a pivot chart and it still looks the same, and we can still control it the same, such as ignoring the blanks, and we can see it still responds. The beauty of it being an object within an existing sheet is that you can have more than one pivot chart in that same sheet. So if you wanted to print them en masse, or you can see it as we have here next to the pivot table that it is linked to. So any changes in this pivot table will affect this pivot chart. So if I go to this pivot table and let's remove the department, and you can see instantly that's responded, and put in the marital status instead. Then the pivot table responds and the pivot chart responds at the same time. There's no need to edit both of them. Whichever one you edit, it will affect the other. Because we could actually select the pivot chart and remove the marital status, and drop in the county, and you can see that the pivot table responds. So they're interlinked. Nothing you can do about them being joined together, but we can now see them both at the same time. And if I filter out the blank here on the chart, you can see it also filters that blank out of the pivot table. So that's the ability to move the pivot chart. And as we've said, you could move multiple charts into the same sheet. So we go to the P chart, Pivot Chart Tools, move the chart, and we're going to move that into ptable as well. Okay, now we have two pivot charts in here, and we could place them one over the other so you can see them like that, or we could resize them so that they're a lot smaller, and then put them next to each other. That way you can compare multiple items at the same time. Obviously, if you make them too small, you can't really read their contents, and you would need to start going in and editing the size of the font here, for example. Format the axes. But even though logically you would expect to control the font within this format in the axes, even within text options, it's not. You actually need to go back to the Home ribbon, but still with this axis selected, and reduce the font size here. So there we are, that's quite small. So I don't need this format axis option. If I were to lose the legend, then I would gain some space to spread things out. So it's all a matter of customizing, as we've seen previously when we format it. But we can move the pivot charts around. The choice is either as an object in an existing worksheet or as a whole worksheet. And you simply select the Pivot Chart Tools ribbon, Move Chart, and that's where you'll see your options to move to another sheet or to its own sheet, and then give it a sensible name. Defaults here to chart 1 because it will be the first chart. Now if you want to delete a pivot chart because you no longer require it or it doesn't meet your requirements, in this case where it's an object, you simply select that object and delete on the keyboard. We'll remove the object, in this case our pivot chart, from our file and it's gone. If however it's a whole sheet, so if I move this back to being a whole sheet, which I'll call Counties Chart, okay, then I can't just delete the object because I'll be left with an empty chart area. I actually need to delete the sheet. Select the Sheet tab, right click, delete. Are you sure you want to delete this sheet? Yes, I am. And then the pivot table is gone. So you either delete it as an object within another worksheet, or you delete the whole sheet if it's a pivot chart sheet on its own.